Good morning and Merry Christmas. Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I'm the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you would like to stop by and visit us, you can find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. You can also get in touch with us at 812-550-6234, or you could send email to info@riverridgechurch.org. Those are great ways to get your questions or your comments to us, or to get in a request for a future topic of study on this program, and we always love to hear from you. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness, to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. It's good to be back with you after missing last week due to the World Cup. You may have noticed, today is Christmas. Christmas. Decorated trees, Yule logs, gift exchanges, stockings, Christmas carols, red and green everywhere, mistletoe, Santa Claus, wassail, candy canes. Where did all these things come from? You probably don't know at least some of these, even if you participate in these same traditions. But origins can be important things. They can teach us principles that we never noticed, or they can remind us of things that we know, but we tend to forget about, things that are important. They can help us to see more clearly sometimes. I'm sure that many of you already know this, but it may perhaps come as a surprise to some of you to learn that Christmas is not in the Bible. There's no commandment anywhere in here for us to celebrate Jesus' birthday. There's no example of New Testament Christians doing so. Out of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, only two of them, Matthew and Luke, even really mention Jesus' birth. Mark and John considered it unimportant to the gospel of Christ. And yet, of course, Christmas is a given in our day and age. Let's look at why and how it came about. I'm not going to try to explain all of the traditions that I mentioned at the start. Those were just to illustrate that you probably have some gaps in your knowledge, and I hope that that piques your interest in origins. We're going to look at something more fundamental. Why does Christmas exist at all? It's probably not what you expect, and I hope that you'll be reminded of some things about Jesus that maybe you don't think about enough. There's actually some controversy over the origins of Christmas. I know, that's a huge shock, isn't it? There are two main theories, and I'm going to tell you both. Let's start with the currently fashionable scholarly theory. You see, there was this old Jewish belief that so-called great men would die on the same date as the day on which they were born, so that if you added up the years of such a man's life, there wouldn't be a partial year. It wouldn't be, let's say, 75 years and 264 days. It would just be 75 years or 76 years to make everything nice and neat and tidy. And so you would think of Jesus as being the quintessential great man, and naturally his being not only the life of a great man, but the divine life. Of course, you would think that it would be likely to have that sort of neat tidiness to it. And so then that would lead us to conclude that perhaps he died on the same day on which he was born, the same date on which he was born. There's a problem here. Christ pretty clearly didn't die in December. We can actually establish the Jewish date of his crucifixion very clearly in John chapter 19. Let's read verses 14 through 16. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to be crucified. On the day of preparation of the Passover. Day of preparation of the Passover. Okay, so if we turn back to Exodus chapter 12, then we can get a very good date for when Passover occurs. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month every man shall take a lamb according to their fathers' houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons. According to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight." Okay, so let's not get into the confluence of the Passover lamb and Jesus right now, although that's obviously very important. Right now we're concerned with the dating. And we learn that on the 14th day of the first month of the Jewish year is Passover. When is that? Well, the Jews don't use the same calendar as the Julian, really the Gregorian calendar that we use. Our calendar is arranged around the sun and around, well, what Julius Caesar and later on Pope Gregory decided it should be. The Jewish calendar is based on the cycles of the moon, which means that it can be really confusing, but it also means that it's extremely regular. And so it means that we can cross-match. We can take a date from our calendar, and if we know the year, then we can get very often an exact date, or if we can't get an exact date, we can get a very, very close date for one that's on the Jewish calendar. So it's not absolutely certain because we don't actually know exactly what year this took place. It might have been the year 30, it might have been the year 33. Those are the two most likely candidates. But in any case, it, at least from very early times, was decently well agreed that the death of Jesus, that this particular Passover, occurred on March 25th. March 25th. Might be starting to see a bit of a connection now. So, the idea of a birth date isn't always as concrete as we tend to make it out to be. In this case, they're sort of fudging the line between conception and birth. Conceptually speaking, no pun intended, you can see why that would happen. Obviously, if Jesus was conceived on a particular date, on March 25th, then that would be the beginning of that divine life, even though he was still in Mary's womb. Now, the reason that we might do that with Christ is that, particularly with him, his incarnation, his becoming flesh, to quote from John 1:14, is more, let's say, cosmically important than his successful navigation of the birth canal, which at that point is basically a given. So there's some logic to that, and I suppose that it creates a powerful anti-abortion argument for what that's worth. If even the ancients considered Jesus to be, well, Jesus, the Son of God, and God in the flesh from the moment of his conception, but that's not really our point today. Then we jump forward 9 months from March 25th, and voila, December 25th, the supposed birthday of Jesus. Are you buying it? And can you believe that this is the currently favored academic theory? I suppose it doesn't do a whole lot to inspire confidence in academia. There are several problems with this notion. The first one, I guess, is that it assumes that the most significant Christian holiday was born out of stupidity. This Jewish belief about great men dying on their birthdays, well, it's a bit silly, isn't it? There's no evidence that it happened. Was it a universal belief? No, of course not. It was a niche sort of crackpot theory held by people who were obsessed with numerology. In fact, there's very little evidence that the ancient Israelites paid any heed to birthdays at all. Okay, so that's one point. Another point within this problem is that is it true that the birthday and the death day are the same date? Well, not in general. It's highly doubtful in, well, really most cases. It's highly doubtful in the case of Jesus as well. But that's not really the point, I suppose. It's not whether he actually did die on the same day that he was born, or the same day that he was conceived in this case, but if there was a substantial belief that that was the case, then that would at least account for Christmas as we have inherited it, right? He still requires us to do that switching birth for conception thing, which is a little odd. It's not the norm. There's no great reason given for it, although we could come up with a backfilled justification. It's just kind of a weird, baseless assumption. Even if that is a proper assumption, then why consider Jesus' conception to be his sort of date of origin for purposes of satisfying the birthday equals death day thing, but then celebrate his actual birth date instead when he successfully navigated the birth canal, which we said really wasn't all that important? This is just weird. To top that off, having arrived at this bizarre and highly dubious date for his conception of March 25th, now we calculate the date of his birth by adding exactly 9 months. That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works. You think the baby's sitting there in the womb with a little lamp and a calendar scratching off days until his appointed birthday arrives? Of course not. Baby's going to come when baby's going to come, and very seldom does it match up perfectly with our broad generalization of about 9 months. That's not even getting into the bizarre switch from months that last 28 or 29 days. That's the Jewish lunar calendar, the lunar cycle being about 28 and a half days, and then suddenly moving over to the Roman Julian calendar, where a month is however long Julius Caesar says it should be. So we are to believe that, in keeping with an ancient Jewish mystical belief about the numerological appropriateness of dying on your birthday, that the calendar of the hated Roman oppressors was used in this case? Why? Is anybody buying this? It's not impossible. Certainly God can do what he wants, but why? It seems like a lot of awfully careful planning for a highly specific and senseless set of circumstances and assumptions that some people might later make. Now, there is some evidence. There's a 4th century document, that's the earliest that it goes, espousing this view. It's a work in Latin, which may be from John Chrysostom, if you recognize that name. I've picked an excerpt of this document to read, just to give you a taste. Now all this happened before Tiberius became Caesar, at the 11th sunset of the lunar month when the Jews were supposed to celebrate their fast for tabernacles. Afterward, in the 9th year of Tiberius Caesar, the timing of the moon was compiled, and it was discovered that tabernacles in that particular year had been on the 24th of September, the equinox, when the night starts to be longer than the day. He must increase, and I must decrease. That's a quote from John's Gospel. The day decreased compared to the night, which represents the period when the Jews offered God sacrifices according to the law and prophets. This period was the one when John was conceived, and when the Lord found fault with sacrifices. As the prophet Isaiah says, "What use to me are your heaps of sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of the burnt offerings of rams. I do not want the fat of bulls and goats." These were the animals that used to be offered for the sins of the people. They were to end when John the Baptist was conceived. And that is why his father, Zechariah, priest of the Jews, was struck dumb, because the priest's sacrifice for the people's sins were now to stop and be struck dumb. For a priest had come who alone would offer a sacrifice to God of the only spotless lamb for the sins of all. That is why John pointed him out to the Jews. "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." It states very clearly that Zechariah, priest of the Jews, was struck dumb. This is because he offered the sacrifices according to the law and prophets. This meant that, now Christ had come, the law and prophets were fulfilled, and the sacrifices would fall silent. So the law and prophets held sway until John, and specifically until his conception. So yeah, it's a lot like Hebrews. The author jumps around to a lot of different passages and explains the world in a profound way off the back of these scripture citations. The main difference would be that the author of Hebrews knows what he's talking about. Okay, that's too harsh, but there are some problems here. Like, he seems to be assuming that Zechariah is the high priest offering the sacrifices on the Day of Atonement. That's just not true. That's just not true. Also, the basic argument of the whole sermon is that on at least one occasion, God orchestrated an important event and commanded a feast for Israel to coincide with astronomical and meteorological markers, that being the Passover and the associated Feast of Unleavened Bread, which were determined by the full moon, and it roughly coincides with the vernal equinox in the coming of spring. And therefore, so the argument goes, logically, everything else must work the same way. So he assigns Zechariah's temple service to the Feast of Booths based on nothing. That would mean that John's conception occurred right around, we might as well just say, on the autumnal equinox. And 9 months later would be roughly, we might as well just say, exactly the summer solstice. And Luke 1:26 tells us that Jesus was conceived about, we might as well just say, exactly 6 months later, near or exactly on the vernal equinox, March 25th. And therefore, he would have been born right around, you know the drill, exactly 9 months later on December 25th. Presto, Christmas. A neat and tidy arrangement of the yearly calendar, if you're not too particular about it being accurate. But remember, the point isn't that this is true. It's that it was widely believed, and therefore early Christians celebrated Jesus' birth on December 25th. But there are big problems there too. The sermon begins, "My brethren, I don't know if anyone has dared before to understand the mystery of Christ's birth, or has worked out the course of hours, days, and nights by which solstices and equinoxes would be recognized. After all, God said to the famous Job during his sufferings, 'And tell me,' he said, 'whether you know the path of the sun and the moon.'" See what he's saying here? He's not saying, hey, you know how we all believe that Jesus was conceived on the vernal equinox and was born on the winter solstice? Well, let's talk about why. He's also not saying, I've figured out the date of Jesus' birth, and we should totally start celebrating it every year by setting up plastic trees in our living rooms and putting gifts underneath them. Instead, he's taking for granted the accepted birth date of December 25th, and finding justification for it in his eccentric musings about solstices and equinoxes. Christ's birth on December 25th was already accepted, and he's trying to explain what everyone already believes using an entirely new justification, an entirely new idea. So it's pretty evident that the timing of the solstice and the equinox aren't the reason everybody accepted December 25th as Jesus' birthday. That idea seems to be a very new one to the author of this particular work. But at any rate, that is the currently fashionable theory. Now for the less fashionable theory. The Romans held a festival every year from December 17th to 23rd called Saturnalia. Saturnalia, you can see how this obviously comes from the name Saturn, not the planet, but the Titan in Roman myth. And this was associated with things like public banqueting and gift-giving and the upset of social norms so that masters would serve their slaves during this festival and that sort of thing. But although that covers the time of year, roughly, and the gifts and that sort of thing, it is rightly suspect because it's not exactly the right date, and it's not about somebody's birthday. But there's a less well-known Roman holiday. December 25th was regarded by the early 3rd century at the latest, so at least 100 years before that newfangled solstice and equinox theory that we've been reading about. December 25th was regarded as the birthday of Sol Invictus, depicted here over on the left. Why should this be? Well, December 25th marked the winter solstice. Now, the calendar has walked since then, and now the winter solstice occurs on December 21st, or sometimes as late as the 23rd. But that is the shortest day of the year, when the sun is the farthest south in the sky, when the sun seems to be losing the battle with night the worst. And that brings us to the meaning of the name Sol Invictus. Sol is sun. Invictus means unconquered. And this was an idol, a sun god, worshipped for the cyclical battle, let's call it, between day and night, between light and darkness. And so every year, it's as if he is born and increases in power, which goes along with the day getting longer and longer, until the summer solstice occurs, and then he wanes in power until a symbolic death, or near death, in winter. But instead of fading away, he is symbolically reborn every year and becomes powerful again and defeats the darkness again. Notice in the sculpture here how young he looks. That's an odd thing for artistic depictions of gods. It's not completely unique, but it's fairly extraordinary. Can you see any reason that this might have been interesting to early Christians? An astronomical parallel of the story they were told and they believed about death and resurrection, about God reborn to conquer the power of darkness. This association scares some modern Christians. That's part of the reason for the more fashionable and, in my view, significantly less believable theory. There's an aversion to the idea that there could be a pagan origin to my beloved holiday. But, well, let's read one more excerpt from the oldest source to support the theory that celebrating December 25th as Christ's birthday arose out of a quaint Jewish belief plus God's preordination of the Julian calendar, and totally not out of any association with any pagan festival or anything. Speaking of December 25th, he says, "They also call it birthday of the Invictus." But who is Invictus, meaning unconquered, if not our Lord, who suffered death and then conquered it? Or when they call it birthday of the sun, well, Christ is the Son of Righteousness that the prophet Malachi spoke of. The Son of Righteousness shall arise for all you who fear his name. Salvation is in his wings. Well, that's inconvenient. Did Christians just steal older myths and make up a new religion? That's what some people would say. But no, that's not what happened. The author of that old sermon was wrong about a lot of things, but he gets some things right. Malachi 4:2 does talk about the Son of Righteousness who rises with healing in his wings. That is talking about Jesus, and it's not the only such Old Testament reference. In 2 Samuel 23 we find another. Verse 1, "Now these are the last words of David, the oracle of David the son of Jesse, the oracle of the man who was raised on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, the sweet psalmist of Israel." Now remember, who were the Jews told to expect in their Messiah? God calls him my servant David. He calls him the root from the stump of Jesse. He calls him the branch of David. He calls him the son of David. So let's read the last words of David, as we could do with many of David's other poems, the Psalms, from Christ's perspective. Verse 2, "The Spirit of the Lord speaks by me. His word is on my tongue. The God of Israel has spoken. The Rock of Israel has said to me, when one rules justly over men, ruling in the fear of God, he dawns on them like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass to sprout from the earth. For does not my house stand so with God? For he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. For will he not cause to prosper all my help and my desire?" This is about Jesus, how Jesus dawns on them like the morning light. We could look at a few more, but it's not just in the Old Testament that this occurs. If you turn to Matthew 17, we'll see another pretty important one. We don't have time to read the whole passage, but let's at least read the first few verses. "And after 6 days Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him." Peter, James, and John even recognized this from the prophecy in Malachi 4. There's another of these that we can look at after the Gospels in the letters in Ephesians chapter 5. "For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true, and try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, 'Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you.'" Is it any wonder that Christians would notice the symbolism invited by the courses of the sun and the moon and the stars that God himself ordained? Is it any wonder that pagans would notice these things as well, and then corrupt the truth or make up their own stories to go along with it? Is it any wonder that pagans, on becoming Christians, would shun the idols, but revere the glory and majesty of the one true God's creation? Is it any wonder that they'd pick up on his promise to send the Son of Righteousness and then commemorate his birth every year on the day that the physical Son is symbolically reborn? So what? Am I trying to convince you that you should stop celebrating Christmas? No. Am I trying to convince you that you should start celebrating Christmas if you don't already? No. You make your own choice on that, and whatever you choose, do it in faith to glorify God. What is more important is that I want you to learn from history, and from origins, and from mistakes and connections and themes that aren't always readily apparent in our time, in our culture. There is a reason for everything. Sometimes it's a bad reason, but generally we should be the kind of people who seek to understand why the fence is there before we tear it out. Today we have learned that we shouldn't just blindly follow traditions, or scholars for that matter, and that we shouldn't just write them off as being utter foolishness without a second thought. The arrogance of now is a powerful and intoxicating drug, and we should stay away from it. The early Christians were on to something. Perhaps they ran a bit too far with it, but they were on to something. We don't spend enough time thinking of Christ as the light of the world. We are too happy to remain asleep as if it's still nighttime. Wake up. We don't serve the sun, although to watch some of our daily routines, it might kind of seem like we do. But rather, we serve the one who made the sun. In fact, we serve the one who made light to shine even before there was a sun. So walk as children of light, and take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness. Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. If you've been living under the power of darkness, thinking your evil deeds were hidden, and are realizing that the light has come into the world to expose them and eradicate them, then I encourage you to take the opportunity afforded by the symbolism of today to join with the Son of Righteousness, who rises up with healing in his wings. You, too, can exchange your old life of blundering around in the darkness and running into unseen dangers at every turn, and take up a new life, clothed in robes washed and made clean in the blood of the Lamb, and ready to face a hostile world with a clarity of vision and a glorious destination in sight at the end of the long, narrow road. We'd love to be a part of that at River Ridge. We are not the light, but we bear witness about the light, the true light that has come into the world to give light to all who truly wish to see. Please get in touch with us. You can call us or text us at 812-550-6234 or email us at info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh. We gather at 9 a.m. every Sunday for Bible study, 10 a.m. for worship, 4 p.m. for afternoon worship, and 7 p.m. on Wednesdays for another study. I'd love to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.